What impact did Paul have on the early church? Paul blazed the trail for the church to grow into its own institution. Although some may say that because of his previous persecution of the Christians and his relationship with the Jews, his teaching should be taken lightly. But I would argue that that very reality made his testimony more amazing and served him well during his life on the mission field. First, Paul shaped the church's theology. Secondly, he shifted the church from a Jewish to a Greco-Roman institution. And thirdly, he shaped the way the church was structured. Okay, so firstly, he shaped the church's theology. Before I dive in, it's important to understand some things about Paul. Well, we all know that he had a miraculous conversion on his way to Damascus, but what happened before? Well, Paul was a Pharisee, which means that he spent most of his life studying and learning the Mosaic law. He says in the book of Acts, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee." On top of that, his mentor was a guy named Gamaliel, who is a well-known thinker. His day job, as you might say, is what was called a tent maker, constructing these large awnings for the windows of the sort of more urban Roman cities. The windows were large because it was so hot in the summer they wanted ventilation. But if you open up your house to the open air, the sun can just beat right in. So they needed these tent makers to make awnings to cover up their windows. That was his day job, but he was also a Roman citizen, and he lived in a Greek-speaking town called Tarsus, and he was actively persecuting Christians. So this guy was all over the map. It would be if you were a Canadian who went to Harvard that lived in Florida and was a truck driver, like a night truck driver for a living. So this guy was all over the map. Then he converts to Christianity and has this strong call to the mission field. And that's usually what we think of when we think of Paul, right? His mission work and his various writings and his church planting. But his, quote, emphasis on God's grace, his focus on the work of the cross, and his understanding of the status of the law had a huge impact on the development of Christian doctrine, end quote. That's a quote from Dr. Parker. Paul's theology and teaching often differed from Jesus' disciples, which caused some tension in the early church. One of the reasons for this was that Paul actually didn't know Jesus during his earthly life, converted after Jesus was already ascended into heaven after his death and resurrection. And so he didn't have any presuppositions based on Jesus' earthly life or whatever, how Christianity was to be lived out. Whereas the disciples did, who had all been with Jesus, they have an excellent thought. They had that sort of side of the thing to bring to the table, but Paul also had like the clean slate sort of thing. He didn't have any presuppositions. This is what it was. He met Jesus on the road to Damascus. He thought this and this and this, which was good. Both of them were good, but they kind of clashed a few times. Many times. His sort of claim to apostolic status was based on his experiences of God, like his miraculous conversion on the road to Damascus. He sees the light, he hears the voice, it's Jesus. He says, "Why are you persecuting me?" He has that experience. He also has an experience that he talks about of like being taken up to what he calls a third heaven. So that's sort of his claim to fame and why he has the authority to, speak against these apostles who knew Jesus and walked with him in his earthly life. So that's just interesting. Paul is the only apostle to distinctly say that Christ died on the cross for us and rose again for our salvation. This is his teaching on the cross, which is distinct to him. When Paul converted to Christianity, he changed his view on the Mosaic law. The other apostles were living out Christianity far closer to Judaism than Paul thought necessary. Paul had an interesting theology of the Mosaic law, which actually most of the Jews did, which we don't usually think about. They believed that the Judaic law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, not directly from God, but somehow relayed through angels. So when Paul converts to Christianity and believes that this Jesus, God incarnate, lays out these new laws, he's like, oh, well, here, this is the new law. This is the new one. This kind of trumps the Mosaic law. This is coming directly from him. This should be the new law, or like the completion of the law, the fulfillment. Like, this is the next step here. We're looking at this now. Whereas the apostles looked at it more of like, this is the next step for Judaism. Like, let's bring this in with us. But that also led to some confusion as to what we should still hold to in the Mosaic law and what should be like let go of, because this is Jesus's law that he gives us. Love God, love others. This is more important here, you know. Paul actually rebukes Peter for being ashamed of eating with Gentiles, something strictly forbidden in the Mosaic law. When other Jews are sent to the city where Paul is, Paul reportedly kind of shied away from the Gentiles and didn't eat with them anymore. And Paul says, no, you can't do that. Jesus wants it this way, you know. You were doing the right thing before. You shouldn't have doubted yourself there. You made the right call. Which is actually really interesting, because when you think about Paul's earlier life, he was a Pharisee. He dedicated his entire life to believing and committing himself and dedicating himself to the Mosaic law. He believed it so strongly that he thought that this other newfangled thing, Christianity, that was false. No, stamp it out. But here he is, even testifying against that law to his colleague. This brings me to my second point. Paul shifted the church from a Jewish institution to more of a Greco-Roman institution. As I was just saying, the other apostles looked at Christianity almost like another faction of Judaism, but not Paul. What with his belief about the angel law versus the God law, he wanted to bring the church away from the Jewish law and live more fully into the law as ordained by Jesus Christ. So the church became more Greco-Roman because he was more Greco-Roman, and he was the one doing the grunt work of all the church planting and traveling around and reaching all these people. He was laying out all the seeds of what his beliefs were. So do you remember how Paul was a Roman citizen and he lived in a Greek-speaking city, and he had the tent job, and he was really smart, and he was a Pharisee? Well, this was a huge gift to his ministry because he was called mainly to minister to the Gentiles. And his kind of being spread and introduced to all this wide variety of things helped him to communicate to these people. He could speak their languages, he understood their culture, and he was very adaptable. He himself says in 1 Corinthians, I have become all things to all men. His crazy testimony allowed him to deeply empathize with converts. He says in the book of Acts, quote, we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God, end quote. Oftentimes, his arguments to convert these people were using their own sort of rhetorical devices. He would allude to their myths, their laws, and their cultural norms. So in this way, Paul shaped the church into a Greco-Roman institution. Thirdly, Paul shaped the way the church was structured. So as Paul traveled around planting churches, he left the Roman system of patronage behind. In other words, the patron-client system, where one person provides resources and food, or in a church context, the house where they meet together, and then the food afterwards for the people. They're kind of in charge of, running the business. They're the one you come to with any issues or whatever. That's how he set up the church. He was the one going around. He led it this way. That's how he taught the people how to do it. Paul mentions a man named Erastus in the letter to the Romans, and it appears that this guy, Erastus, was the city manager of Corinth and probably was a sponsor to his own group of clients in the city of Corinth. According to Stephen Marquardt, the concepts of patronage and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, reciprocity are, first of all, apparent in the sociology of the letter to Philemon. The letter presupposes that Philemon was a pater familias and the patron of the church that met in his home, end quote. So this guy, Philemon, was a patron also to his group of clients. Paul served as a patron, himself to other members of the early church. One, Phoebe, a deaconess that he speaks of sending to another church to serve them. Also Lydia, who we meet with Paul when he's staying outside the city of Philippi. He meets this woman by a river, and he speaks to her and converts her to Christianity and baptizes her. And she becomes a patron to the church that meets in her home. So Paul's institution of the Roman patronage system set up the way the early church functioned. And even now, our churches are set up similarly. At least some denominations retain this. So in conclusion, Paul impacted the church through the shaping of its theology. He steered it toward becoming a Greco-Roman institution as opposed to Judaic, and he shaped the way it was structured. Thank you.